Welcome to the Professional Technical Interviewee. I'm Taylor Dorsett. In my 6-year career in technical recruiting, I realized that just about every company does technical interviews differently. Many very good senior engineers do not do well in technical interviews, despite being great developers. The only way to get better at interviewing is to practice. Many early career engineers don't really know what a technical interview is like until they're in their first one. Our goal here is to change that and shed some light on the technical interview. My guest today is Ben Wilhelm. Ben's a self-taught developer. He worked as an instructor for several years at a coding bootcamp and is currently a staff engineer at Screencastify. He also creates a lot of content targeted at early career engineers. I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Ben Wilhelm. He is currently a staff engineer at Screencastify. Before that, he was a senior instructor at Fullstack Academy. And then you also currently are building courses and content for Bootcamp grads to help them be successful in their first job. How are you?
That's right. I'm great, Taylor. How you doing?
Doing well. It's always it's another beautiful day in Chicago.
More or less.
Yeah. We'll get there, right? I give you the brief intro, but do you want to share anything more about kind of your team or what you currently do?
So I'm a staff engineer. I am. It's funny. My title has DevOps in the role, although that's a new thing for me. I made a shift into DevOps, and I'm currently our only DevOps engineer. We have grown from a team of 3 engineers at the beginning of the year to I think we're 17 engineers now.
Oh, wow.
Because we make screencasting software for K through 12 education. So it's real busy right now.
Sure.
And so we've scaled up very quickly. And so that's been... For me personally, that's been a really interesting challenge and has made me think a lot about my own time being self-taught. I'm a self-taught engineer from the days before boot camps, and getting into my first job and feeling just adrift with everything that was around me. And from everything I talked to bootcamp grads, that I was an instructor, and I still have contact with a lot of bootcamp grads, and that when they get into their first job, suddenly it's very different from the sort of controlled environment that they were used to and the tech stack that they've taught themselves, oftentimes even post bootcamp. That it's funny to be in that position of discomfort again, and it's a very real thing. To start suddenly feel like, I have to teach myself a lot of stuff very quickly. And so it's been, I don't know, it's been sort of a moment of solidarity with so many of my former students to sort of just, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, it never goes away. You'll have these moments throughout your career. You'll never just hit your stride and go. And you just have to constantly be growing, and it'll always be a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I worked at Actualize, which is a coding boot camp, a number of years ago. And we had an instructor, maybe 2 when I was there, who basically decided they wanted to move back into a full-time engineering role. And it was always interesting speaking with them. And I was, doing my best to help them find jobs and connect them with people. And they were always like, I don't know exactly where to slot myself, because they're like, I know I'm a good engineer, but it's been a long time since I've worked fully in a new tech stack and just, had that, just the software development lifecycle is very different than the teaching software development, course load. So it was always interesting conversations for me, and hearing their own self-reflection of where they kind of thought their skill set would fit in with the market.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really good point, that the specific technologies are not as important as the engineering mindset. And the ability to learn new technologies, the ability to understand fundamentals is kind of a loaded word, but to understand what I like to say to what it means to decompose problems and apply the right solution to the smallest problem that you can possibly create. A bunch of small problems and then put them all back together, instead of just memorizing a bunch of APIs,
Sure. Absolutely. It's something we talk a lot about on the show is what do you do when you're just at a point where you go, I don't even know where to start, right? And but you have to find what can you start with, right? Because then at least you can chip some little piece away, then you can keep moving forward, right? But I think often, and very much people early in their career, you just get to that panic mode or that just information overload, right? Which I think often happens in interviews, but also, like you're saying, early in a job where it's just drinking from the fire hose, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And have you done, I'm kind of interested, have you done a lot of technical interviews recently? Because I know you haven't been with Screencastify terribly long.
Yeah, you know, I most of the interviews that I have done since I've been at Screencastify have been for managers more than ICs. So that's a different kind of thing you're interviewing for.
Sure.
And prior to that, I worked for 2 years as a consultant, so I wasn't interviewing anyone. Yeah. And prior to that, I was an instructor. So I was doing a lot of practice interviews, so I was doing depending on the time of the cohort, I might be doing 10 interviews a day. Right.
Yeah.
But lately, no, I haven't been doing a ton of interviews.
Yeah. And on the other side of the table, did you go through rounds of interviews before you found Screencastify, or were you kind of introduced to them?
No, I have been incredibly fortunate to not have to interview very much in my career. Sure. And I'm not going to lie, it makes me a little bit self-conscious.
Interesting.
So, you know, I had to interview sort of early on, you know, when I was like first getting my first job. And then basically every job since then has been with someone that the person hiring me sort of plucked me from, like, they moved on and then plucked me and took me along.
Yeah.
Which, you know, has been great. But it means that I don't have a ton of experience interviewing, which I think is, I don't know. I feel fortunate, but also, like I said, a little bit insecure about it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this show, is showing that, you know, one, it's something that you can get better at, but it is almost its own skill set, right?
Yeah,
like you said, like, you're getting drawn or, you know, kind of plucked from company to company because someone recognizes this individual knows how to do the work. And when they're in a new role and they have a role that you could be a good fit for, they go, oh, I should reach out to Ben, right? It doesn't really matter if you can solve their arbitrary coding problem in an interview or not, if they know that you can do the work. So that interviewing is just such an interesting thing. And I think it's very much shows that the power of a network, right? If you're actually building relationships and, like, I don't know, maybe a decent human being to some extent as well, when you're working, that can really be fruitful later on in your career, where people go, oh, I know so-and-so who'd be a good fit for this, right? Rather than you having to cold apply to hundreds of roles to get a job, right?
Well, and especially because it means that when you first get that idea that you're like, I wonder if maybe it's time to start looking around, you just start talking to the people that you know.
Yeah.
And the people that you know, if they have an open position, they would say, oh, you know, you'd be good for this here. Is that interesting to you? Like, that's what happened at Screencastify. As I was talking to a friend there, and he said, oh, well, I need an engineer yesterday. And you know, it was because that's the thing that you got to remember is, like, hiring is risky. Hiring, like, an engineer is expensive, and an engineer that doesn't pan out and doesn't fit with the team that's an expensive mistake, or at least something that needs to be remedied, and that takes time and expense. And so people are always going to, like, if you're in a hiring position, you're always going to go with the known quantity.
Yeah.
And so the more you can be a known quantity to people, the better you can find your way to more jobs, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's something that is really difficult to think about early in a career, especially if you're looking for that first job, because it does feel like, you got to pound the algorithm practice, and you have to apply to as many places as possible, which are hugely important, right? Just from a numbers perspective. But it's very easy to forget that, like, oh, there's also I don't know, the networking aspect of it, like that can open a lot of doors as well.
Absolutely. Even at the beginning, even for your first job. Yeah. I got my first job, like I was interviewing all over the place. The first job I got was somebody that I had done theater with 5 years prior.
Yeah.
Like somebody from my old industry who is now in my new industry was able to get me in front. I still had to interview for that job, but was able to get me in front of someone with a recommendation, with a good, said, like paved the way. And yeah.
Yeah, I've shared this before, but that was my path as well, was basically just through networking of senior engineers that I'd worked with in the past. And, I had kind of a conversation with one that said, oh, you studied Vue at your boot camp. I have some Vue work. It's really basic stuff, but like if you can do it, then you could start today, tomorrow, whenever it works for you, right? So like it was paid work that, that was part-time stuff, but that helped me land a full-time job shortly after that, right? So I think it is sometimes just those conversations. I don't typically ask about this, but I'm very curious because we have similar backgrounds in the fact that I also have a theater degree. I know you were self-taught. I went through a boot camp. It's a little bit different, right? But I'm just curious if you can share it seems like there are actually a lot of theater majors, but maybe even arts majors might be the right term to put around it, that are kind of shifting into engineering, that have a lot of that same insecurity around interviewing. Is there anything you may have to share with people that come from that background?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your arts background, your humanities background can be your differentiator. You have to find the person who recognizes that, though. Not everyone recognizes that. Yeah. But I'm not discounting the value of solid technical chops. Like, do that, study your algorithms, do your technical interview practice. But the thing I am firmly convinced that the thing that has led like directly to my success as an engineer is being able to be in a room with multiple people, multiple stakeholders, understand what's important, be able to, I don't want to say play those politics as much as align people in what, like, be able to prioritize interests and prioritize objectives in a way that is humane.
Yeah.
In a way that makes people feel like they want to get, maybe I didn't quite get the thing that I wanted, but I understand now why we're going for what we're going for, and let's all get on board. Like to be able to work with, honestly, it's just working with people, to be able to work well with people, which is a thing that, especially from the performing arts. I wasn't an actor. I was a lighting designer. And so I was frequently in a room with a bunch of different disciplines trying to create something that only existed in our heads.
Yeah.
Which sounds an awful lot like writing software, right? So like being able to come from that and apply those soft skills on top of the hard skills, it makes you a very, very desirable candidate. But you have to learn to articulate that too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I'm curious. You kind of have two different, like you said, your interviewing currently has been more so for managers, but then you've also done lots of mock interviews in the past. I guess, what are you evaluating for, kind of looking for? There's two pretty different buckets, but if you could get some insight into maybe both sides.
Sure. I mean, for an individual contributor, and especially for someone getting started, like early, or their first or second job, I'm evaluating a lot less about whether they know our particular stack, whether they know the technologies that we know, or that we work in. I want to see that they have a foothold in them, but I'm not super concerned about, like, because chances are you've only worked in one full stack, right, in any depth. So I'm not super concerned that it's going to match perfectly with ours. What I want to see is that you can think for yourself, that you have a good understanding of your own limitations, that you will move confidently in the things that you know, but you will ask for help in the things that you don't, and that you can recognize the shift.
Sure.
The other thing that I sort of alluded to is like, can you look at a complex problem and break it down into smaller problems? And, I think probably because of my own background, I tend to not lean really heavily on technical chops when I'm interviewing. And I tend to ask more sort of system design questions. Sounds more intricate than they really are, but much more about like, can you get a high level overview of what, like, can you make sense of this problem that I hand you, and break it down into its problems, and over the course of that, usually what I do, especially because when you're interviewing an earlier career engineer, their knowledge is going to be spotty. They're going to be really deep on some things and really shallow on others. And so if you come in with a specific question that just happens to land where they are not competent, you might totally miss out on a great fit, right? Yeah. And I've never worked for Apple where I can be super choosy about who I hire. Like, again, when I need an engineer, I need him yesterday. And so I want to make sure that I can get, I don't have a lot of tolerance for false negatives.
Sure.
Like I could if I was working at a much more prestigious company, probably, right? Yeah. So what I tend to do is I come at it from a very high level kind of problem, and when I see the person get some foothold in something, I'll probably dig deeper, or sometimes purposely push them into a place they're not comfortable and see kind of where they go. I don't often like to write code in a tech interview because I think that you get too laser focused on one small problem. And again, if you end up that you're on the problem that's not in their wheelhouse, then sure. It's not, you might have totally missed on something. So I like to do a lot more sort of verbal interview. And then for engineering managers, I want to hear about what you've done previously as the head of a team. I want to hear about how you interface with stakeholders on a project, how you are able to, translate and prioritize those needs into something that is actionable for your engineers, how you can interface with other engineering managers. There are often competing needs between different teams. And then I actually am a little more interested in whether you either specifically whether the stack that we're working in, or whether you can really demonstrate that you can hit it running and get up to speed on it quickly. And again, that is always going to depend kind of on the particular managerial role of how much they're expected to be writing code. At Screencastify, our managers are still contributing a significant amount of code, so they do need to be familiar with what we're doing. But
yeah, okay, I think that's really helpful, especially from the perspective of just knowing. I think that shift is often hard for maybe senior level individual contributors to make, because they don't necessarily, they're used to thinking about, I was able to do X, and it's a very different mindset to go, the impact I was able to help my team make is this, right? Which is kind of a very different mindset to get into. And I think hard to articulate, especially early as someone shifting into management, to articulate in an interview.
Yeah. The best way I heard it put was that, when you're an IC, you're being judged by your own performance. And when you're a manager, you're being judged by your team's performance.
Yeah.
And that is so true, and a really, really difficult mind shift to make. And to be perfectly honest, one that I failed at. Like I am not a manager, and that is by design. Like I got into management for a bit, and I don't know if I was good at it, but I did not like it. And I like being judged by my own contributions.
Well, you're a kindred spirit then. I managed people for several years, and very quickly, I think it was the same mindset where I went, I don't know. Maybe at some point in the future I'd be interested in it again, but at this point in time, I'm like, I really enjoy being able to know what I'm doing every day and how that impacts other people, but not have to worry about, 5-10 other people and their impact, right?
The flip side of that is that I really do enjoy mentorship. Like I like being a resource to other engineers on the team. I like being able to provide guidance and help and jump in and offer assistance where necessary. But but I don't want to be managing a project.
Yeah. What's interesting is I feel like that role is often hard to find because I think there's not a good title for that in many places. And I think that individual ends up being a manager often, right? Or kind of dragged into management. And when I look back in my recruiting career, actually, that was where I felt I was the most successful, was I was kind of the number 2 in an office. And we all were managed by the same individual, but I was kind of able to help that person and make sure nothing slipped through the cracks, but also able to help with all the mentorship, because the manager had a lot of other things to worry about, but so-and-so might need some help on one particular thing, and I was able to do that while also contributing on my own. And that's something that I feel like is harder to, maybe I just haven't seen it as much as engineering than a sales focused mindset or a sales role. But that's something that I feel like is really important and really helps teams do really well, is if you have a strong lead who's actually a true mentor, who probably could be a manager, but chooses to be in that role and enjoys that role.
Well, I think that's becoming more common in the title staff engineer. Like that's my title at Screencastify, and that is what it means. Is like you probably have some place that is more or less your responsibility on the team, but you are expected not just to like own feature delivery, but to be you are a anchor of expertise on the team, and you can be a mentor to other younger developers, or you can, provide, you probably had a long career that you can provide guidance or perspective on things and sort of contribute around even where you are sort of anchored in one place, probably.
Yeah. Interesting. That's something I need to do more research around. I always think those, call them like the Riker roles, right? The number 2 spots are like so helpful. Well, great. Well, do you have a kind of a standardized system that you're using? Or I guess, again, when you were doing mock interviews, how are you trying to evaluate people? Or was it different depending on the role? Like, I think sometimes it's just helpful for people to hear what were the main things that you were looking at, and did that system change depending on the individual? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, it's similar to what I was saying earlier about the difference between an IC and a manager. I mean, basically as you are progressing through seniority, like depending on how senior level the role that I'm interviewing for is, I'm going to be looking at more about, how have you been able to own your leadership, like own your place, like own your seniority, basically. How have you been helping the engineers who are younger than you or less experienced than you to level up, and how have you been making a effort to level up with the engineers who are more senior than you, or if there are none, maybe you come from a small company and you just feel like you're kind of topped out where you are. Like, how are you using other resources around to grow there? I mean, we have a fairly standardized system at Screencastify where we send out a technical assessment ahead of time. And everyone has the option, most opt to do it from, in asynchronously and send us what they do and send us, kind of a video walking through it. But they definitely have the option to do it as an interview with us.
Oh, interesting.
Because, there's a lot of, there's been a lot of pushback around the idea of a take-home assessment, because a lot of folks say like, well, I don't have time. I don't have that kind of time, basically. Like and man, I've got young kids. I get it. Like, yeah, I probably would do the same. It's like, no, can we just schedule an hour during the day that I can talk to you?
Yeah.
You can get whatever technical assessment you need out of me there. If I have that option, I'm going to go with that option every time.
Yeah. That's really
that might not have been true earlier in my career, though. I would have been more excited to like dig in and take, show everything I can do and spend 12 hours on it or whatever. But
yeah, it feels like there is kind of two camps, right? There's the live coding interview is stressful and it's not a good example of, what someone can actually do. We should all do take homes. And then the people in the, take homes take, 4 to 12 hours and I should be paid for that work. Or, and maybe, it's doing work for the company or something like that. It feels like there's both camps maybe are have their merits, right? But also have their flaws, which is why interviewing is hard, right? And
interviewing is the worst. There's no way around it. It sucks for everybody.
Absolutely. Well, that brings me to my next question. I know you said you were a little insecure about it, or you feel that way sometimes. How do you think in the past you've done at technical interviews, or if you were thrown into an interview setting now, how confident do you feel?
I think it really, really is going to depend on the company. I'm working for Screencastify now. That is the first company I've worked for that hasn't doing production work. First company I've worked for that hasn't been a consultancy. So it's a really, really different mindset when you're working with a long-lived product versus a set of clients where you are, we weren't doing bad work, but what you index for, what you prioritize is, can I get something like, do we have, ideally you're working for a consultancy that seeks out a lot of the same kinds of clients so you can build internal efficiencies. So you're not solving new problems over and over, because if you're solving new problems every time, those are expensive. And if you can get that work, that's great. But if you're bidding against other people and you're in a cost war and, consultancy is hard. Consultancy, like agency work is really, really exhausting. And so I think though that I would do well in that kind of environment. I think that like I said, I one of the reasons I think I did do well in that environment goes back to my theater experience, goes back to my production work, is like, we've got a hard deadline. The show opens and we're making something new every time. And we get through it and we figure it out and we break it down and we work through and we prioritize, and that's not necessary. Get rid of it. Like, whereas if I was interviewing in some place that is going to, like, agencies are almost never going to interview you on like hard out, like strict algorithms, right? Yeah. You're not going to be doing a lot of whiteboarding in an agency environment, but they also don't pay as well. But if I were to go into an environment where I was going to have to do like a true whiteboarding, algorithm interview, I would need to do some serious studying and brushing up again. Despite that, like, I trained people who then went and got jobs at Google. Like it's all stuff that, like, it's up in here somewhere, but it's not anything I use every day. So like, I would have to really brush up. Interviewing is its own skill.
Yeah. So what's when you say it's up here somewhere, right? But it's actually really interesting to me that I think often people contain the knowledge, but it's totally different having the knowledge and being able to pull it out in, I was going to say a 30-minute interview setting, but even a 3-minute, when I'm asked the question and now I have to start to formulate some type of response and think through different data structures that I can apply in this question. Like that is a rapid recall of those topics and those data structures that that is very different than even a real world situation where you're sitting down and going, great, okay, what do we need to do for this problem, right? And you're never going to go, we have 5 minutes to solve this right, before we're going to implement over the rest of this product. It's just a really interesting thing that I think you have to get used to, is being able to do that quickly, right? And it's totally different from just learning the data structures themselves or the algorithms or whatever they may be.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm curious, do you have any type of system that you would use to break down, or is there anything that you taught in the past? I know I've attended some of your courses, right, on basically destructuring, kind of looking at testing as well. But do you have any type of system around doing interviews?
Gosh, I can't take credit for this. I'm going to give full credit to Fullstack Academy. Go just Google Reacto, REACTO, Fullstack Academy, and find their blog post where they publicized it. Like, this is the method that they teach when you go to Fullstack. Yeah, and it is a step-by-step sort of like, you still have to know your algorithms, but it's the like, follow these steps to keep your cool and keep your head in your interview. And it goes, I'll see if I can remember it because it's been so long, but it's, oh gosh. It's repeat. So repeat the question, examples. I think the A is algorithm. No, approach. Sorry. Approach. Examples, approach. So like, come up with sort of your high level approach. Then go to code. Like, first 3, then you start writing your code. Then you I think T is test it, and then O is optimize. Yeah. Nice. And I think that's actually a fairly good framework to kind of go with any, like, it's specifically, they do it specifically for whiteboard interviews for coding algorithm problems. But I think that's a pretty good framework just generally for keeping your head in a question. Like, someone throws you a question and you're like, gah! And you say, stop, I'm going to repeat it, because that gives you a little bit of time and makes sure that you have understanding. And you can clarify things in there, and gives you a little bit of time to think. And then, examples, approach, then like code or, concrete implementation, and then check it and optimize.
Yeah, that's, I think even that first chunk is something that so many people forget about, right? It's like, I've seen very often, and even early on in my technical interviews, right? The first thing is, okay, well, let me start writing code. And now I realize that's like, I can't think abstractly while also typing on the keyboard, right? Those have to be really 2 separate processes. And I realize now often I would just start typing because that was just some way to get my brain working, which I think repeating the question and, talking through your approach does that same thing, but in a much more collaborative way. And there's not the feeling of like, oh, now that I've written this thing down, I have to use it to some extent.
Yeah. Right? Now you're committed, right? Yeah. Like now you're down an alley.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, that's very helpful. And I'll link to that post in the show notes, because I think that's something that I'm always looking for. What is something someone can fall back on when they see or are presented with a problem where they go, I have no idea. And it's just that fight or flight fear, they get the pit sweat, and immediately you have to do something in that moment. Right. And at least having a short way to work through it is helpful.
Yeah. I don't know if that, honestly, if that blog post is still up, but it used to be. We used to link to it in a lot of our promotional materials. So yeah, probably it's still there.
I'll find something.
Yeah.
Any tips or advice for engineers that are either going into technical interviews or maybe even, since this seems to be an area that you're especially interested in, like people who are going into that first job?
Going into the first job, I would say, don't be in a rush to prove yourself. Learn to just be comfortable in the fact that you're not going to know things at the beginning. Your insecurities are going to just shoot through the roof when you land in that first job, and it is okay. You've been hired for a reason. Spend your time getting to know things. Don't be afraid to take time to do tutorials on the particular tech that you're working in, or don't be afraid to ask questions around, if you've got a question about the code that you're working in, but just expect that you're not going to be super productive for months in your first job. Months in a new job, generally, you're not going to be contributing at full potential for a while, but especially in your first job in a new industry, be kind to yourself.
Yeah. I think that's something that's just helpful for me to hear right now. As someone who's recently shifted into this industry, I think it also depends on where you come from, right? But coming from a sales background where it's numbers matter and productivity matters, and that's the only thing because it impacts the bottom line. It's a very different mindset from oh, it's been 3 days and I still can't figure out how to set up this environment correctly. And I've got nothing done other than tried 40 different ways to do this, right? And that is just a place of fear and insecurity and holy shit, the world's falling apart.
But
easy.
Let me elaborate on that, because if you're in that moment, it is so you very quickly the insecurity, the anger, then you start lashing out. You start oh, why is this like this? This is ridiculous. Use those moments as learning opportunities. It sounds trite, but keep your inquisitive nature. You got into code because you were inquisitive. Almost certainly. That's why I got in. It's a new puzzle every day. Keep that. Recognize that it's just your inquisitiveness needs to be on a longer time frame right now.
Yeah.
Everything that you come up against is an opportunity to better understand what you're working with. And the other thing is, I think of it like breathing. You can't exhale until you've inhaled.
Interesting.
Right? You can't put something out. You can't produce anything until you've consumed some knowledge, until you've inhaled and made sense of things. So don't go in and try and exhale right away if you haven't inhaled.
Yeah, that's great advice. And just something that I've noticed as well is I think having some type of mentorship internally at the company, and I think this speaks to what you were speaking about early on, right? Which is just having literally a mentor that you can talk to early on is very helpful, and I think is at least maybe you don't need to say I feel like I'm doing awful and everything's going to explode, but at least someone to talk to who can help you through those issues gives a lot more comfort than just being isolated right in that moment, which can be terrifying.
Yeah. Remember that you're part of a team. And so don't try and do everything by yourself, because it won't be productive.
Yeah. Great. Well, any other advice for folks going into interviews or early career folks to keep in mind?
Yeah, just remember that the interviewee usually, unless they're a jerk, wants you to succeed. They are probably flooded with more resumes than they know what to do with. And so if they have picked you, first off, they see something that is worth spending an hour of their day on. And an hour of my day, not just the hour, but splitting up a long window of time that I can be writing code with an hour meeting in the middle is That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so if I'm giving you an hour of my time in the middle of my workday, I want this to be worthwhile. I want this to be like, yes, we did it. We did it. So like, remember that person wants you to succeed. The other thing is like, I just say it again. I will just like keep repeating, like, breathe. Mm-hmm. Give yourself that first moment when you are asked a question, repeat it back, give yourself whatever you got to do to like take a minute, let your thoughts form. Like, don't exhale before you inhale.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Something I learned when I was in sales, and, you know, I'd have stressful times or overwhelming days, was just literally I would stop and force myself to count to 10 and take a deep breath on each finger. Right. And every time that helped, at least to some extent. Maybe my problem wasn't gone, but at least I was okay. Now I can move forward. Like, I breathe a little bit. And that's something I started doing in interviews early on too, technical interviews, was I would just force myself to sit there, and maybe mostly being Zoom interviews, my hands would be under the table and I'm trying to make sure I'm breathing. But that's something that I think can, like you said, just be helpful for people, because you have to at least be able to see the situation before you just try to start answering questions, right?
And you can say to your interviewer, like, can I just have a minute to think? Mm-hmm. Like, they're software engineers. They understand the value of like, can I just get a minute to think through this? Hang on.
Yeah, totally.
If someone faults you for asking for a minute to think, you probably don't want to work on that team.
Yeah. It's a two-way street. That's the thing that I think is really hard to also keep in mind, especially early career, is like, you're interviewing the other individual as well. So it's always, you would want the interview to be somewhat like a work situation that you'd actually be interested in going to join, right?
Yeah. I would tell my students at Fullstack that what you always want to try and do, if you're asked a question that you like, think of your knowledge in 3 sort of concentric rings. Like, the inner ring is the stuff that you just know it, and you know it. And if you're asked that question, answer it and stand by it. Don't waffle. Don't answer with a question mark. Just like answer that question. If you're asked something in the next ring out, which is like things you're sort of familiar with, you've maybe done a toy project or you've read a bit about it, but you haven't really worked with it much. Admit to that. Say that. Say exactly what the extent of your knowledge is there, and start drawing parallels or asking questions back to the things you do know. Yeah. So like, you might say like, oh, well, I've never used MongoDB, but I've read about it a little bit. It's, I understand that it's a document database rather than tabular data. And so like that's interesting that it doesn't have a schema. I wonder how you would index that. And sometimes the interviewer might be like, no, don't worry about it. Just use Postgres. It's fine. If that's what you know, we'll use Postgres. But like, always be pulling, like, you want to be having a conversation with a colleague. You want that person to picture themselves working with you. Yeah. And so the more you can spark conversations and show that you can hold an intelligent conversation and less just answer questions, the better. So like, again, the third ring out are the things you just don't know at all. Admit to that, say that, ask, and like say, if you didn't know anything about Mongo, you would say like, I don't know, I've never used it. I know Postgres. How are they different? And then the interviewer might say, well, it's a document model instead of a tables model. Like, how? Then you can start asking intelligent questions, and again, like, show that you are a smart person and like understand the things you know and can draw intelligent conclusions about other things and ask intelligent questions.
Yeah, Ben, I think that's such incredible advice, because it is, treating it like a conversation makes it easier to do those things as well, right? Because if it was a work colleague, anyone can think of a situation where you didn't know something at work, and your boss or your coworker isn't going to be like, you don't know that. They're going to go, oh, okay, let me share more about it, right? Like, what do you know about this, and how can we help you get up to speed? And I think just treating interviews like a conversation, or it's like you're trying to solve this problem with this individual, there's a lot of worth in that, just from a mindset perspective as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, before we move on to the technical portion, any interviewing horror stories on either side of the table you're willing to share?
Yeah. Well, so it's not a horror story from an interview I gave where I was the interviewer. Somebody he took the interview from a coffee shop, and it was noisy, and he had bad internet, and like, it was just terrible. It was just terrible all around. And he was also not a very good candidate for the job. And it went very badly, but like, find a quiet place, have good internet, like treat this with a little bit of something. I don't know. But yeah, I once early in my career, this would have been probably about 2014. I had an interview with Civis Analytics, and the interview already wasn't going great. I had already made it through a few rounds, I was kind of surprised by, but the interview was not going great. And at the end, I think the interviewer just like wanted to just like give me something. And she was like, well, you're starting a new project. Like, what do you do when you just start a new project? And I blanked, froze, nothing, zero, like probably 10 seconds of silence. And I just went, I don't know.
Oh no.
I don't, like, that was it. And that was the end of the interview. Like it is the worst possible thing I could imagine. Like, I couldn't have even imagined that I would have done that. And it just like, I just got in that death spiral in my head of like, this is going badly. Oh God, say something. No, but it's going so badly. Oh God, say something. But it's been 15 seconds. You haven't said anything, but say something. Like, oh, it was terrible. Needless to say, I did not get that job.
I can make myself sweat just thinking about that.
Yeah, me too. But here I am. It all worked out. I'm fine.
Yeah. The nice part about interviewing, is that there's always more companies, right?
I mean, that's the thing. Like, I tell everyone, treat every interview as practice for the next one. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. As a reminder, this interview has 2 parts. You can find the second half, which is the live technical interview, on YouTube at The Professional Technical Interviewee. The link will be in the show notes. Until next time, keep practicing.